Welcome to the FPA podcast. I'm your host, Marney Reid, and today we're diving into one of the most important and potentially overwhelming parts of early practice is understanding how you're paid and how to start planning for retirement. We're joined by financial planner Will Walker, CFP, ChFC from United Capital Financial Advisors. Hi, Will.
Marney, happy to be here. Happy to help. It's good to see you. And hi, Spencer. It's nice to see you.
And orthopedic hip and knee surgeon, Dr. Spencer Summers from Hospital for Special Surgery in West Palm Beach. Thanks for joining us, Spencer.
Hey, Marnie. Hey, Will. Great to be here and excellent to have the opportunity to talk with you both.
Will, before surgeons can even think about retirement planning, they really need to understand how they're getting paid because that drives everything else. Can you walk us through the different employment models surgeons may encounter early in their careers as it applies specifically to income, taxes, etc.?
This is a very important, like you said, there are going to be three basic models that they're going to look at. The first one's going to be the W-2 model, which basically says you're an employee of probably a hospital or a large group, something like that, a university. I like to think of this as a traditional employment structure. Everything is going to be pretty much automatic for the surgeon. Taxes are going to be withheld. The benefits are going to be here are your benefits. You can choose. You're going to get your options. You'll get to pick them. It's very predictable for them, and it makes it a lot easier when it comes to tax time and everything. So that's the W-2 model. Then you can you could be a 1099 employee, which is basically an independent contractor. Okay. There are practices that use it as a hybrid model sometimes, but basically you're paid in gross income. So no taxes are going to be withheld, which is nice when you see that bottom line. But, most of the time when tax time comes, if you haven't handled your taxes quarterly, it could be a big tax bill, which is when you have that big tax bill, it's very tough to write that check to the government. So you got to make sure you're very diligent with what your taxes are. Also, when it comes to like your employee benefits, again, a lot of it is on you. You may not have anything offered to you, so you have to do it. You have to go out and pick the benefits, get the benefits. So it is tough sometimes for the surgeon because, sometimes you don't have the time for that. But it does give you a lot of flexibility overall. And then also, you get the potential deductions that you could get for the things that you're doing in your taxes, whether it's equipment or, your travel or, your home office and things like that. So it does give the surgeon a lot more flexibility. Third model, which I think a lot of times is the goal for most, I talk to, the goal is, if you can go to that K1 and you basically become a partner in a group or, an AC, you can get some ownership in the company. You go from the employee to the owner, which is, again, I think it gives you the most flexibility, but it also makes it a lot more complex for most people. From a tax planning perspective, I can tell you, you're going to need a CPA to help you with that. And it's very taxing, in more ways than one. You can get paid a salary in some cases, and then you'll also get what's called profit sharing. Maybe there's some passive income if the group owns the real estate that you're working out of and things like that. But again, I think overall, this is a lot of times the goal. You go from that employee model to becoming an owner, and then, you're in charge basically with the other partners.
Is there a world where people are a 1099 private practice and then they transition into a K1, or are you a 1099 but then K1's aside, kind of like I have an LLC but I file as an S corp?
Yeah, I think a lot of times you can. I think a lot of times what happens is there's almost like a transition, Marty. Like you would go from the W-2 employee, maybe then you become a 1099, or a hybrid. And then I think a lot of times you would move into the partnership, if that makes sense. So you can transition to it. I think it depends on if the partnership wants to bring in partners.
That makes sense. Okay. Spencer, when you were graduating fellowship, how much did you know about these employment models, if anything? And did you learn from mentors or co-fellows? Did, anyone bring this up as you were, transitioning into that first job?
So I guess I didn't go into the job hunt process totally naive. Personal finance and trying to tackle some of these things has been an interest of mine for a while, maybe since early in residency. I had a hand surgeon as a second year resident who taught me about the Roth IRA. And ever since there, I've been following this stuff and listening to the White Coat Investor. And that was, an amazing thing he did. And he did it to every single second year resident who came on his rotation. And if you think about teaching people about a Roth IRA when they're a second year resident and maybe they wouldn't have found out about it for 5 years. And so then over the course of a career, those 5 years of contributions might turn into close to 500 plus $1,000 or something. So starting this stuff early is really important. So I would encourage all listeners, regardless of what their level is in training or where they are in the process, the best time to start learning about this stuff is now. So start educating yourself. When I was doing the job hunt, I had some understanding of the W-2 1099 atmosphere because my fellowship was paid out as a hybrid of both of those. We were W-2 for the academic facility and then paid as 1099 through another hospital where we basically took call. And so I was aware of withholding taxes, like Will said, for the 1099 income. Otherwise, it can be a big shocker for you. But when I started practice, the K1 stuff was totally new to me. And at least in my situation, that came about with discussing buy-in to an ASC, an ambulatory surgery center. And where I got most of my information for that stuff was mainly from my partners, the senior partners or older residents that had been in similar situations before me. So you grab onto anybody that you can to learn this stuff. You certainly should get professional help when you're trying to prepare your taxes and as things get more and more complicated, but you should always start by educating yourself as much as possible. And whether it's through podcasts or talking to senior mentors or older residents, that's a good place to start.
I love that. And I also feel to the point that you made, everyone has a slightly different situation and a lot of different variables in their life. So asking as many different people, and I would actually, for the surgeons out there, especially the ones in training still, ask the reps you're in with every day. Some of them are W-2, some are 1099, some have financial wealth advisors and such. Will, let's talk about something Spencer brought up. I am seeing that there are some practices where they want you to start off as a W-2. Maybe sometimes that's the local health system that's in a PSA arrangement with the practice or even the institution itself, and then give surgeons this option to transition into a 1099. Can you talk about why a surgeon would go 1099 since there are so many other things to think about, like getting your own insurance and paying that tax bill, etc., and kind of paint that picture of the benefits of being, staying W-2 versus the benefits of going 1099?
It's a good question, and I think you are seeing it more and more today. I think in that first couple of years, the surgeon's looking for stability. Before you give the option, like you said, to go 1099, and I think the main thing is I like the word flexibility. I think that if you go 1099, one of the advantages are you can be more flexible in how you do things, how much you are withholding for taxes. You can get a little creative in there with some of the tax planning and such. I wouldn't, get too creative too soon. But I think it does give that flexibility that a surgeon would want going forward. And also, I think from a long-term perspective, when you're trying to build your assets and build up your net worth and produce that long-term wealth, I think it does give you a lot of flexibility with retirement plans, which, that can be definitely very beneficial for a surgeon if they go that route.
Spencer, knowing what you know now, you're currently at an institution where you are a W-2 and there's not really an option, at least not right now, for you to make that change. If you knew what you know now, what would you go tell your younger self when you were interviewing? I'm not saying you would pick a different job, but just a little bit more nuances of, hey, we've got this pure private practice option, we've got this, employed model. What's the advice you'd give younger Spencer?
So yes, full disclosure, I'm incredibly happy where I am, and we are knocking it out of the park down here in sunny South Florida. But if I had to give any advice to my former self, I would say, honestly, maybe don't get so lost in the weeds of some of the nuances of the contract structure in terms of are you W-2? When are you going to have a chance to get the 1099 or these things we're talking about? I think that the more important thing to focus on out the gate is one, who your partners are going to be, because those are the people that you're going to be working with and relying upon for hopefully the next few decades. And then looking at your growth potential for your clinical practice, second. And then third, obviously, what would be the financial implications going forward if everything works out like you hope it works out with your clinical practice? what is that going to look like? And everyone, just as Will said, everyone's going to start out in an employed model in orthopedics, unless you go and do locum tenens somewhere and you're 1099, but everyone is going to be employed. There's different ways to be paid when you're employed. You can be base salary, you can be salary plus percent of collections, you can be salary plus RVU collections. And then what you would want to know is moving forward after that, what does the second contract look like? Is there an opportunity to break free of the complete employee handcuffs? Are you strictly going to be W-2, or is it going to be a hybrid? Is there a part of the practice that you can buy into? Because in some practices, some friends in their private practice, but they're staying on W-2, even though they're on their second or third contract. It's not necessarily advantageous for them to buy into the physician portion of the practice, but it is advantageous for them to buy into the real estate, and that might be carved out separately. And so then they would make money as a K1 through the real estate venture or through the surgery center venture or through the different DMEs. So it can all be parceled out separately. And so every situation is unique, as you said, but I would not focus too much on that in the initial contract because you're going to be employed no matter what. You want to know what the opportunities are going forward, assuming that you are going to be doing well and that you like your partners and all that stuff. That's what I would tell Junior Spencer.
That makes a lot of sense. So I have to ask you this. So if you were to speak on behalf of the early career surgeon, most of the surgeons I talk to, they don't even think about having a wealth advisor right away. And I'm going to guess that it's because of the massive amount of debt that most of you carry. I was blessed enough not to, but I mean, my first job within the first month, my dad, took me into the executive with Morgan Stanley that he, referred business to and vice versa. And we sat down and we opened up a brokerage account for me. I mean, there was no, hey, do you think you should do this? It was, hey, I made an appointment for us. We're going in, Thursday at 2 p.m. I'm, making that up. What is it that you feel like? Is it the debt that most surgeons aren't thinking about a wealth advisor? Or, how do you feel in aggregate on that?
I would say that the average early career surgeon, they are thinking about finances quite a bit, their personal finances, but there's a lot of competing interests. There's a lot of good uses for money, but not enough money to go around. As you said, debt is a top priority for a lot of people and paying down debt. And sometimes it's just simpler if you have high interest debt from maybe you privatize your federal loans are like 7 or 8%. And it's just easier to say, you know what? I'm going to get a guaranteed 7 or 8% return. I'm just going to pay off debt. I'm not going to complicate my finances any further. I don't need a special advisor or anything for the moment. I'm just going to pay off debt and you go on autopilot that, and that's fine. But there's lots of things. So there's debt, there's getting a home down payment, there's practice buy-in, there's moving costs. There's so many things for an early surgeon as they're starting out what they should do. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but they need to first educate themselves about personal finance, what all these things are, what the alphabet soup of retirement accounts really means, what's a 401k, what's an IRA, what's a backdoor Roth, what's an HSA, all these things. Educate yourself, then do a little bit of introspection. How much of a do-it-yourselfer do you want to be? Or do you prefer the convenience and just say, hey, I'm going to pay somebody so that I don't have to worry about it? But I would say, even if you're going to do that, obviously you should educate yourself so that you know that you're getting good advice. And then if you are going to go seek advice, sure, Will can talk to this more, but there's different options. If your main concern is tax strategy or tax efficiency, then maybe you just get an accountant. If you just want somebody to help you develop a plan so you can get your ducks in a row and you know with this money coming in, X is going to go to debt, Y is going to go to home down payment, then you just do some sort of fee-only financial planner. And if you want somebody there with you for the long haul to sort of coach you through all that process and help build your wealth moving forward at a fee, then maybe you would go with a wealth advisor or something. But, so there's a large way to go about it, but you need to start by educating yourself, then figuring out your priorities, and then how much a do-it-yourselfer you actually want to be.
That makes sense. Will, you came to FPA through one of our founding board members, who he and his wife, both surgeons, work with you. And if there's ever a do-it-yourself type of person, it's this kind of person. So, any response to that or any misconceptions that maybe you see surgeons when they come to you and you think, man, I wish I could have worked with you even just a couple years before so we could have accomplished X, Y, and Z?
Spencer's answer there was great. I mean, again, I think it was a great answer. He's very detailed. I'm thinking maybe he wants to switch careers and come on over and work with me. But no, so I
Send me
think
the
that
contract, Will.
I think that the one thing that I think a lot of times when you talk to surgeons about their misconceptions and all this, I think they feel like sometimes they got to do everything at once. I mean, again, Spencer just went into it. He listed, 6 or 7, 8 things that you're all looking at. And sometimes I want to say, look, just take a step back and you got to get organized. I mean, to me, it's like building a house. You get your foundation in order, and then you can kind of build upon it so it doesn't come crashing down if something does, God forbid, happen or something along those lines. So I think a lot of times it's get organized because again, you are going to have a lot of decisions to make, and then make sure that you are educated. I love that what Spencer said. I think make sure you educate yourself so you know which direction you want to go. Talk to your spouse, bring her into it, or him or her into it, and just make sure that you're both on the same page. You'd be amazed at how many times I see that where that becomes very challenging if they're not on the same page and their priorities are way off and not aligned.
Will, do you also have to get a certification in marriage counseling in your profession?
Spencer, sometimes I do get asked. That's funny you say that because sometimes I do get asked if we are marriage counselors. But yeah, again, you'd be amazed. I mean, you'd be amazed what you see. There's no communication there. And then you sit down and this one's got this goal and this priority. And the other one is like, oh, wait a second. Very interesting conversations. I can tell you that.
I believe it. So, in your experience, if somebody has tried to do it themselves for, let's say, 5 years or something, and then they are overwhelmed or they think they mess things up and they go see you, what would you say are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen people make or the biggest errors in your experience?
It's funny. I think a lot of times it probably seems so elementary, and it's just such a good question. I think sometimes I see it where they don't have emergency savings, Spencer. Like they're so worried about plowing all this money into retirement accounts, which again, I think is very important. I don't doubt that. Sometimes the emergency savings are off. That's one of the things I see. And I'm just talking like liquid cash, right? That, you're covering your expenses or whatever if something comes up. Now, surgeons are you're paid pretty well, right? They're paid pretty well, especially in your example, 5 years in, usually they're paid pretty well. But again, you want to make sure you have emergency savings there. The other thing is, I call it scattered asset syndrome. They have stuff just all over the place, sensor, like just everywhere. And you're just like, all right. So sometimes it's like, all right, let's take this step down. Let's get you all organized. Let's make sure we can see everything. And then we can kind of go from there.
Well, that also loops in, Will, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't a good, strong financial planner or wealth advisor, that's in estate planning too, right? I mean, that's where you want to have a living trust. You want to put a lot of different accounts under that or whatnot if they're not accounts that are already tied to beneficiaries and kind of help condense everything. And then, can I ask a question too? Because I used to be the opposite of what you just described. I used to be so concerned about the rainy day fund that on a regular basis, I would have anywhere from 50 to 70K in a savings account making zero interest. And when I got the wealth advisor that I currently have now, they were able to put it into an account that's liquid. I can email them and within 3 days get access to that if I need, but it's earning 5 to 8% per annum that I was completely missing, just by putting it into just a standard, Bank of America, Wells Fargo checking account.
Marty, it's incredible that, we see that a lot. Again, a checking account is there to me for inflows and outflows. You're going to keep maybe like 1 month of your expenses in there if you have to. Your paychecks go in. But after that, it's got to be high yield savings, something that's getting some interest, even if it's completely liquid in just a bank or, yeah, in your case too, some kind of brokerage account or something where you can find higher yield, maybe through using mutual funds or ETFs or something like that. That again, you're just kind of building yourself layers that you can protect yourself. I say protect, I should say, because I use the word hedge. People think hedge funds. It's not really hedge funds. It's just hedging against the certain things that could come up, basically. But yeah, you definitely want to make sure that you're earning interest on that cash. It can't sit in a checking account. I try to keep the checking accounts pretty lean, I guess you would say.
That makes sense. Another thing too is, Spencer alluded to this alphabet soup and it's, such nebulous terms. Let's say that I'm a surgeon. I've gotten to the point where I've, paid off a decent amount of my loans or at least the high interest, ones that I'm carrying. I've gotten a mortgage now. Maybe I've done the thing where I live like a resident for 2 to 3 years, make sure I'm happy there, make sure I want to stay. And so now I decide, okay, what do I do now? Can you walk through, Roth IRA 529s? Most of the physicians I meet at around that age have, kids under the age of 10. So there's the consideration of, maybe the kid will go to college, right? Can you walk through what you might recommend for, tax efficiency and considerations for things like that?
No, I mean, a great question. I think, when before you look at those accounts too, that you figure out, is the priority going to be college or is it going to be retirement? You got to start somewhere, right? A lot of times we'll say, you're not going to be able to take out loans for your retirement. I'm not saying, I mean, again, so you probably would start there inside of if you're a W-2 employee, you're probably going to have a 401k or a 403b, that you can start funding there. It's an easy way to do it. Sometimes they'll give you, a match or something like that, profit sharing or something along those lines. So it is an easy way to put the money away there. When you look at the traditional 401k, 403b versus a Roth, I mean, to me, it all comes down to the taxation of it. The traditional is going to be pre-tax, which means you're deferring all those taxes. So you're getting a little tax break today. It comes off right off your income at tax time, but you're deferring the taxes for the next, let's say, 30 years. And then when you take withdrawals in retirement, you're taxed on every dollar that just came out and the growth. The Roth is the opposite. It's after tax money going in there. And, you no tax break today, but you still are deferring everything for the future. And then all the growth and everything when you get to retirement is tax free. So it just depends on, I mean, again, you're most likely if you're a surgeon and you're doing well, you're going to be in a high tax bracket at all times. So I think finding a good balance, again, is a good place to go with inside of those employer plans.
Spencer, by and large, what are you seeing with interest rates on student loans?
I am happy to say that I no longer look at this as closely because I was fortunate enough to pay off my loans maybe
Congrats.
a year and a half ago. But at least for when I was taking out loans back in 2012 to 2016, they ranged anywhere from 8 to 6.2%. So those were the federal loans. And then, when people are in residency, sometimes they'll decide to privatize their loans because when I was a resident, the interest rate environment was so low that you'd then refinance to a private lender at 2 or 3% or something. That didn't pay off very well for people who did that because then the COVID strike hit and there was a freeze on federal interest loans. So, that was maybe the one point in history where it didn't play out to refinance your loans at a lower rate. But the federal loans, I think, are still probably in that ballpark. I haven't checked recently, but that's generally where it is. Nowadays, people have an option for repaying their loans if they do 10 years at a nonprofit hospital, and they make certain contributions. So if they're called qualified contributions for a period of 10 years, then the loan will be totally forgiven. Will may know more about this than me, but so in orthopedics, you do 5 years at an academic center in residency. You do your 1 year fellowship also almost always at a nonprofit academic center. So that's 6 years already. So then if your first job is at a nonprofit hospital, then you work there for 4 years. And so you're really only having to pay off your loans for 4 years until they're forgiven. So there's lots of options. You can refinance, you can pay it all off, or you can go for loan forgiveness nowadays.
So, Will, I've heard you mention several times that the decision to pay off the loans, and obviously depending on how the market is, right now, at least from what I'm seeing, is depending on how your portfolio is arranged, you could see a 10 to 16% return on your investment per year. So if you're carrying a loan at a 6 to 8% interest rate, does it make more sense to do a balance of paying off the loans, especially if you're not depending on, that loan forgiveness that Spencer just recommended, and kind of have a balance so that you're still making a decent percentage? Or is it really just come down to that emotional, do you need to just pay it off to get that off your chest to move on? What are your thoughts there? Because I'm sure you see the gamut.
No, sometimes it's a tough decision, and a lot of times you're right. There is that emotional decision that I don't want debt, right? And I want to pay it off as quick as possible. So when you start aggressively paying off loans, could you be hurting yourself elsewhere? Potentially. I mean, again, I think balance is usually the best strategy, in my opinion, when you're looking at this, because I think you can, if you have loans that are around that, 6, 7%, that's probably like a crossover point to say, all right, well, now we really got to look at this and find a balance. Because if a loan is under 4, under 5, odds are, you're going to invest, right? When you get into that 5, 6, getting close to 7, you got to start making some choices. Anything over 7, forget it. You're better off paying down the loan quickly, right? And paying the debt off as quick as possible. But when you're in that 4, 5, that 5 and 6 range there, I think that's where you got to find a balance. Because I think to your point, if you're investing, you can find some investments, depending on what it is, that could earn that. And that's where you would go. And then I think it's finding that right balance where if you are organized and you could say, all right, I have this disposable income to figure out to enhance my goal or accelerate them. Well, then you can look at it and go, well, I can pay down some more on the loan, but then I can also continue to fund, my retirement or college or whatever you want. The other side of that too, which is something that I think is overlooked sometimes, is again, I'm not advocating to do this, but even if you just plowed money into a savings account and build it up, right? In a high yield savings account, I mean, at some point you could turn around and potentially just, what I like to say, knock the loan right out with the lump sum payment. I know that would take away your savings, but again, at least you're earning the interest on the retirement account and, you're not having the lost opportunity cost of not earning anything for yourself.
That makes sense. Spencer, what do you feel like were the smartest financial decisions that you in your situation made? And what would your advice be to other physicians who are, married, wife stays at home, and you have a couple of kids? And then also think about your colleague that maybe you have two incomes that are working, and what decisions would you have made if you had two?
So by far the smartest financial decision I ever made is marrying my wife because she is very frugal, she's incredibly intelligent, and she doesn't go for all things shining. So she's by far the best financial decision I ever made. And I think that's probably true for everybody. Who you choose to marry is going to have massive consequences on your finances. Just like if you get divorced, it can be pretty catastrophic. So your spouse is incredibly important. And as Will said, before, when you're creating your financial plan, go through it with your spouse. They're obviously just as important in that process as you are. So you need to do it together. But so that was the most important thing I ever did. The next best thing I would say is trying to live like a resident for 2 years until loans are paid off, not getting the fancy new car just yet, things like that. The continued delayed gratification, which we were all rather accustomed to, you just maintain it for a couple of years. I think that was really helpful. And then becoming an owner whenever possible is also probably the best thing that doctors can do. And so whether that's an ambulatory surgery center, whether that's buying the real estate that your practice is on, whether that's becoming a partner, that's, I would say, the next goal and the best thing that you can do for yourself.
I love it. Well, let's wrap up with the biggest advice that you would give to physicians who are finding themselves, let's say that they've paid down some debt, they've picked up a mortgage, they're making good money, and they're starting to look at the next thing. What are your biggest tips for them, Will?
Automate your savings. Honestly, whatever you're doing, try to automate it so you don't get caught up, when you're starting to put money away. Like when you're starting to really establish and building the wealth that, you're going to have over time. I think if you automate it, you're going to be definitely in a good spot. And then the other thing I would definitely say is stay on top of it. Stay on top of it. Don't, even if you're using an advisor, not using an advisor, with your spouse, you have to stay on top of it. You have to stay on track. Don't lose it. Don't just say, well, now it's automated, so I don't have to check up on it. Not accurate. Stay with it. Stay on top of it. If it's automated, stay on top of it. Make sure you're on track. Make sure you're meeting your goals. Make sure you're dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I think that, again, you want to make sure that everything continues to progress and you'll be able to meet whatever goal you set yourself up for.
Absolutely incredible dialogue. Thank you so much, Will and Spencer, for sharing this with us. And we hope for our listeners that today's conversation gives you at least a clearer starting point, and if you'd like to connect with Will on any of the topics we've covered today, please email him at will, W-I-L-L, .walker, W-A-L-K-E-R, at unitedcapitalwealth.com. Thanks for joining us, and see you on the next episode of the FPA Podcast. The opinions expressed in this podcast are Will Walker's and do not represent the opinions of his employer, United Capital. The commentary contained herein is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as tax, legal, or investment advice. You should obtain your own tax, legal, or investment advice based on your circumstances. The material is based on sources deemed reliable but is not guaranteed.